Okay, I think we can start. Let me first start by welcoming you all to the Union of Concerned Scientists video call. I want to thank you for taking some time out of your afternoon to join us. I'm Kathy, the Executive Director of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I am really grateful for you taking the time. Now, when we originally planned this webinar, the conversation about racial justice and COVID-19 climate impacts was already well grounded in the disproportionate impacts that both the coronavirus and climate change are having on our communities of color. And then, of course, over the past week, following the death of George Floyd, we're reminded and recognized yet again the deep wounds of racism in our society and the failure of our country to address the devaluation of Black lives and other racially marginalized lives, to truly transform us and our country into a place of freedom and opportunity for everyone. So the conversation that we're going to have today will encompass these really difficult issues and reflect the very real grief and pain being felt by communities of color and all of those that support them. These kinds of conversations are hard and they're necessary, and I want to thank you and I want to thank our speakers for being part of them today. I know that many of you on the call today are among some of our most dedicated supporters. Of course, we are grateful for it. Your support powers the work of the people that you're going to be hearing from today. And it allows us really to ensure that science and policy is used to address our nation's most pressing problems and to ensure that there are equitable outcomes for all. With the death of George Floyd and so many others before him, and the outpouring of protests and the violent response that we've seen by some police on these protesters and on journalists, and against a backdrop of actions and inactions by our government on COVID and on climate, along with sweeping job losses and economic instability, we here at UCS recognize and really feel the strain of these compounding factors. And we want to use our voice and use our reach to be part of the movement for change. So before I introduce our speakers, I want to just take a minute to tell you how we're going to use, what the format's going to be like today. Everyone joining the call is on mute and your cameras are off, which means we will not see you or hear any background noise. If you're joining by telephone, you will not be able to ask a question, but you're encouraged to follow up with us afterwards if you have them. If you're joining us on the video with a video call, you can select the Q&A box. It's on the lower center of your screen and type in a question at any time, and we will answer as many of them as we can after we get through a few of the presentations. So I want to introduce to you the colleagues who are here with me today. Dr. Adrienne Hollis, Dr. Gretchen Goldman, Dr. Rachel Cleetus are going to all speak about the connection between these issues and the way that we can and should expect our institutions to change to support and protect those who bear the disproportionate burden in our society, and the role that UCS can play and should play in this moment and beyond. So let me introduce them. Adrienne Hollis is our Senior Climate Justice and Health Scientist with a PhD in biomedical science. And in that role, Adrienne leads the development and the design and the implementation of methods for accessing and documenting health impacts of climate change on communities of color and traditionally other disenfranchised groups. Gretchen Goldman is the research director of our Center for Science and Democracy. Gretchen has a PhD in environmental engineering. She leads research efforts on the role of science in public policy, with a focus on topics that range from scientific integrity in government decision-making to political interference in science-based standards on such things as climate change and chemicals. And also Rachel Cleetus, who is our policy director in our climate and energy program, who has a PhD in economics, and she leads our program's efforts in designing effective and equitable policies to address climate change and advocating for their implementation. So with that introduction and few introductory remarks, I would like to turn it over to Adrienne. And you might be on mute.
Sorry about that. I don't know why I was having technical difficulties all of a sudden. So let me share my screen with you. I have a couple of slides. I think that's the professor in me coming out. Just briefly, you know, when we think about the environment, textbook definition, it's circumstances, objects, and conditions under which we are surrounded. But the environment, a more common definition, environment is everything. The air you breathe, the water you drink, the plants, the animals, and it plays the most important role in us turning out as healthy human beings and everybody being healthy human beings. So the definition that environmental justice communities and others like to use is that it's where we work, pray, play, go to school, and as well as our physical and natural environment. Now, I think I like to describe environmental justice as an umbrella. And under that umbrella falls a number of other social justice issues like climate justice and immigration justice and things like that. So that's why it's important to realize that everything is encompassed, everything that affects communities under any of those spokes affects us all as an environmental justice issue. Environmental racism isn't new. You know, we know that race is the most significant predictor of whether or not a person will live next to a contaminating facility. And if you, in your neighborhood, walked around if you drove around, looking for the landfill, you'd probably find it located somewhere near a community of color. So what is environmental justice? Quickly, getting to the root of the issue. When we talk about environmental justice, what we're talking about is not equal pollution, it's equal protection under the law. And as a lawyer, I can truly say that there are no laws that specifically suggest that we should be all suffering from environmental injustices or environmental pollution. And this is just a picture of Port Arthur, Texas, one of the communities that we work with at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I just wanted to share that photo with you. So quickly, climate change affects us all. It affects communities first and worst. And rising temperatures, extreme weather, sea level rising, flooding, and increasing CO2 levels are issues that we all have to face. But environmental justice communities are more at risk for a number of reasons, including their location. And we're talking about systemic and historical racism that has placed them in areas where they are more at risk. You know, they may be located surrounded by a number of facilities, or they may be in areas that were not deemed part of the floodplain, but now because of climate change, those areas flood regularly. Some of the effects that you see with climate change include the lungs, liver, heart, mouth, just about every part of your body. And the people who are affected, including homeless, people who work outside, infants and children, older adults, low-income household, people living in areas with traditionally cooler temperatures, and certain racial and ethnic groups. That's the environmental justice component. I put this in here because I want you to remember this when I show you the at-risk populations for COVID-19. So with COVID-19, what we know is that African Americans are more at risk. It's not genetic, it's because of such things as where they're located, as well as the fact that they have a higher incidence of certain conditions, which may also be due to where they're located. Because it's pretty hard to eat healthy if you don't have access to a grocery store, or if you don't have access to healthy foods, and you don't have access to green space or places to walk, depending on the how your community is structured. So look at the risk factors for CDC. Older people, people with chronic lung disease or moderate to severe asthma, which you will see in air pollution around communities, as will you see increased heart attacks or serious heart conditions in those same communities. We also wanted to include people who are immunocompromised, people with severe obesity, I've explained that, and people with diabetes, kidney disease, and dialysis. So some of the same groups that are already affected by climate change, you would expect to see them affected by COVID-19. And I just put this in here because of the relationship in the literature between air pollution or particulate matter specifically, and the possible relationship between that and the location of the fact that COVID-19 can be carried on those particulate matter pieces. And that's important because this is the air pollution that people are exposed to. This is what they're inhaling. And now the suggestion is that on that particulate matter, you have the COVID-19 particles, which of course makes you more at risk for climate change. So I'll end with this. What we're in now is a syndemic. And what that means is you have a number of health problems involving 2 or more illnesses or afflictions that contribute to excess burden of disease in the population. So African Americans are facing a number of conditions, climate change, COVID-19, environmental pollution in general, and finally racism. And I would be at fault if I don't mention the fact that all of this is one of the reasons, is the main reason you see people out protesting and the conditions that we have lived under. And I want to point out that the use of tear gas is also thought to exacerbate the chances of you getting COVID-19 infection, because the way it affects your lungs. So that's something else to keep in mind. And on that note, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrienne. So let me turn it over now to Gretchen.
Thanks so much, Kathy, and thank you, Adrienne, for that. I've also been thinking a lot about this syndemic, as Adrienne points out, and the intersections between a lot of these issues that are currently happening. Between the COVID crisis, the death of George Floyd, and the national conversation that we're having in the country this week, it is very clear how all of these factors intersect to and affect populations of color in particular more so. So when we think about the climate crisis and economic injustice and disproportionate impacts of pollution on communities of color, we're seeing that all of those burdens are added together and in many ways affecting the very same people. And this, to me, really crystallizes a lot of the reasons that we are doing what we're doing at UCS and the problems that we're working on and trying to think about in this holistic way. I've been at UCS for nearly a decade, and I was a supporter before that. And I've always thought of UCS's role as being to worry about challenges before they're here, before things are on the broader radar of the population, that we at UCS think seriously about problems that we're facing and are about to face, and work toward the solutions sooner so that we're ready to hand them to decision makers when the problems get here. And I think of that frame a lot these days when we think about a lot of the challenges that we're now facing as a country. We, of course, couldn't have predicted COVID, but we knew that it was important to keep a strong federal science enterprise. We knew that we need the CDC to have scientists working on this hard problem, and they must be able to be free to talk about those issues and communicate to the public to protect people. And this is true of climate change as well. We don't necessarily know when the next storm or flood or wildfire will hit, but we know what those impacts might be, who they might affect, and we know what government leaders, what the business community, what the public should do to ensure that the worst impacts are avoided and that people are out of harm's way. So we've been working to understand many of the inequities that Adrienne mentioned earlier in who's exposed to pollution, who is in harm's way from climate impacts, and who's at greater risk of COVID, and then advocate for changes to the status quo on all of these issues. As Adrienne mentioned, the same conditions that make COVID deadlier for people are the same conditions that also make air pollution deadlier for people. There may be other vulnerabilities in who are essential workers and who might be more at risk of contracting COVID and also having the outcomes be worse when they get it. So we see a lot of these challenges intersect and build on each other. And so that's one reason we want to think bigger and look at all the different ways that we can be effective in advocating for addressing these inequities and making our nation stronger in various ways because of it. One of those things that's never been more apparent than ever is the need for really good science to be happening at the federal level. We need scientists to be able to work on these tough problems and agencies to be able to carry out their missions so that they can protect us from these environmental justice issues, from COVID, from climate impacts. And so we're seeing that becomes a huge thing that we've been continuously working on. And it's crucial that we be able to allow scientists to lead the nation, and so that we can use science for the public good. We've been doing that through a lot of federal scientific integrity work, a lot of analyzing of the disproportionate impacts of environmental pollution on different populations. We've looked at some of the Trump administration rollbacks of environmental policies and the degree to which those have impacted communities of color and low-income communities. There's a lot of work to do both in documenting the problem and working through solutions, but we're excited to be able to contribute in that space and continue to inform the conversation as the fast pace of all of these issues happen and as the inequities in our system get worse. So we're going to continue to work on that, and I'm happy to take any questions on some of the specific things we're working on as well. And with that, I will pass it to Rachel, who's next.
Thank you so much, Gretchen, and thank you all for joining today. I wanted to start by acknowledging the moment we're in as a nation, as a global community, that is calling us to be our best selves. On one hand, we are seeing all the things laid bare that we have done wrong up to this point. The fact that the racism, the economic inequality are not centering people's lives and their health over and above the economy. The economy needs to work for people, not the other way around. And the ways in which we have lost touch with what really matters are all coming to full relief right now when we look around us. What gives me hope, though, is that there are so many, many more people who see it now, and all of you on this call who are our supporters are amongst those people. And we can be a force for change, and we must be a force for change in this moment. So I get asked often, aren't emissions down? Isn't that a good thing from a climate perspective? And yes, emissions are down. They're down about 17% in the first part of this year. But what a brutal, unfair, unjust way. We know we can do better because we have solutions available to us that help us actually move towards a clean energy economy, move away from fossil fuel dependence that is causing so much pollution, not just heat trapping emissions, but also in environmental justice communities, the terrible burden of the emissions from fossil fuels, the air and water pollution. So the choice we have here is, as we come out of these crises, these multiple compounding crises, are we going to make the right choices in terms of the energy infrastructure, the kind of economy we want to invest in? So at UCS, we've been thinking a lot about getting out of silos, not thinking about climate as a problem we're going to solve in a corner by itself. As Adrienne pointed out, as Gretchen pointed out, these are compounding problems that are all coming at us at the same time. And our solution set must be intersectional. So we must be thinking about solutions that center people's health and well-being, even as they cut heat trapping emissions. Solutions that cut all of the pollution from our fossil fuel dependence, even as they cut heat trapping emissions. So we have been working along with partners and allies, labor, environmental justice, renewable energy advocates, climate resilience advocates, to be pushing Congress in this moment, to be pushing our federal government in this moment, to really think big picture and adopt these kinds of policies, not just what serves a narrow purpose, but what serves the public good in this moment. We've also been pointing out as a climate team that we don't have the luxury of picking one crisis at a time. We are in multiple crises. And we're going to see compound risk this summer. For example, NOAA is predicting an above average hurricane season. If any of these hurricanes make landfall, they're going to come on communities that are already suffering from the burden of COVID-19, racism, socioeconomic disparities. Unemployment numbers are skyrocketing. We have more than 40 million people unemployed as of now. Tomorrow, the unemployment rate is likely to be announced as nearing 20%. We have not seen that level of unemployment rate in our country since the Great Depression. So in the midst of this, imagine a hurricane season or a wildfire season. So we have been trying to point out that let's get out ahead of this. Let's get ready ahead of time. We've also been pointing out on the energy side of our team that in this moment, we are reminded again who really struggles with paying their energy bills. It's low-income people, communities of color, many of whom are losing jobs at a higher rate than the national average. So what about them this summer when heat waves strike? We also have been advocating for a moratorium on utility shutoffs for non-bill payment. This is something that environmental justice advocates have been championing for a long time. People can literally die during heat waves because their power is turned off because they haven't paid bills. So this is that moment. We are being called to, yes, advocate for climate solutions, but solutions that center people, solutions that will make us a better nation and a nation that ensures that these benefits flow to everyone. We have to reclaim our democracy in this moment, and we have to really stand up to the authoritarian and racist rhetoric that's coming from the highest levels of our administration. The Trump administration, sorry. I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you, Gretchen, for your remarks. So we'll turn to questions. So again, please use the Q&A box that's in the center of your screen if you want to ask a question, and I will be looking at them and reading them out to our speakers. I want to give people, I see that questions are being typed in, but to give people a little more time to get them in, let me start with this question that we've heard, which is understanding that leadership on these issues is not coming from the White House at the moment. And in fact, may be in many ways exacerbating the divide? What are the pathways to action that we can leverage to help communities that have been bearing the weight of all of these impacts? So I would love to hear, can I ask you to respond first?
Me?
Yeah, yes.
I was coughing, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Pollen, in case you guys want. Yeah, I think that given the current state of the administration, one of the best things to do is partner with communities. As a matter of fact, they are reaching out to UCS, and we started developing strong partnerships with them, because if we can support their efforts from a scientific perspective, then that's going to help when it comes to funding, when it comes to policy development. And so it's about recognizing not only community science that's generated by the community, but it's also helping to generate science that answers questions that community members have.
Okay, are there others on the panel that would like to speak to this question? Otherwise, I'll jump into the Q&A box.
Sounds good, Kathy.
Okay. Well, several people have asked if this session is being recorded and will be available, and the answer to that is yes, it will be, and we will upload it on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So you will be able to find it there. So we have a number of questions here, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So here's a question. If the executive branch continues to dismiss science, does UCS recommend a contingency approach to mitigate the lack of federal research? So with that one, I may ask Gretchen first.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, it's a good question, because we are seeing the federal government abdicate its responsibility to conduct and use science in many ways. And this is of great concern to us. And as a recent example, the administration cut off this independent panel that was set to look at particulate matter pollution, which of course, as Adrienne referenced, has just been linked potentially to making COVID deadlier for people. And so we didn't get to see the kind of science advice that expert panel was set to do to inform EPA standards that protect people from particulate matter. And UCS, in fact, convened the panel to meet anyway. We brought them together, we hosted them to be able to meet, even though the administration had disbanded them, so that their scientific advice could still reach the EPA, and that's now informing the administration's decision on that rule. So if we see this continued dismissal of science by the federal government, we're going to look at other ways that we can do that kind of thing, where we put science back into the process. There's a lot of potential for working to ensure that our government decisions are still informed by science, even if the administration doesn't want it to be. And then also, I'd say, though, that of course is not a long-term solution. We ultimately need the government to step up and do what is their job, which is to ensure they're making evidence-based decisions and relying on science. And so we'll also be insisting that ultimately happen as well.
So Gretchen, while you have the floor, there's a question about, does UCS also do work or do research in the area of political science, how to foster systemic changes to move from being a plutocracy to a democracy?
Yeah, that's another really great question. In the Center for Science and Democracy, we have a fellow who does specifically political science and studying social movements. So he's doing a lot of really exciting work for us now, thinking about how do we mobilize the scientific community and others in support of democracy and evidence, and really using expertise to inform how we as a nation move forward. And it's especially an exciting time to have him here. His name is Fernando, and so he's been doing really great work just this week, actually connecting what scholarly communities, academic communities can do to address racial justice issues, along with scientific movement building as well.
Great. Thanks, Gretchen. There's some interest, Adrienne, in your use of the word syndemic as a term that people hadn't used before or heard before, and they wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yes, and I also put the link in the chat at the request of someone before. So actually, it was sort of it was in a report by the Lancet called "The Global Syndemic of Obesity, Undernutrition, and Climate Change." That was in 2019, and so I put that link in there. And what it talks about really is that when you have multiple interrelated epidemics happening at the same time, and this is in my opinion and others, this is the perfect storm. Perfect, not in a good way, but that racism is an epidemic. And of course, the issues around climate justice are lead to that epidemic, which where we have vulnerable communities who are hit first and worst. And COVID-19 is a pandemic, so it originally was an epidemic. So there in lies my premise. I'm speaking like a lawyer, I know, for the use of the word syndemic, because we have all of these different effects happening, and a lot of them are affecting the same population at the same time.
Thank you, Adrienne.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel, I will give this question to you. There's a question about infrastructure projects. Question being, what infrastructure projects can we champion to help us attract and keep construction workers and their unions and others on our side? Are there things that we can do from an infrastructure point of view?
Absolutely. So I think, as everybody knows, our current infrastructure around our nation is, in any case, aging and outdated and in desperate need of upgrading. We saw this major dam failure, for example, in Michigan recently. And we know that in any case, regardless of climate change, we did have to make these huge investments. And now we have a choice. As we're making these investments, let's make sure that they're low carbon and climate resilient at the same time. And this kind of low carbon, climate resilient infrastructure can create a lot of jobs while improving health and ensuring that we are better able to meet our climate goals. So there is a lot of opportunities here as we build out the renewable energy industry, for example. Right now, you might be aware that the renewable energy industry has lost 600,000 jobs. And that is, it is taking a terrible toll on our nation's renewable energy workers. So the opportunity we have right now, first of all, is to make sure that that industry continues to flourish, and we've been advocating in Congress for that. We also, at the same time, can be advancing other types of infrastructure projects like mass transit, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure that can all at the same time help meet our climate goals while keeping people safer. So again, UCS has been advocating as part of any infrastructure bill, including, for example, the House bill that was just announced this past week around transportation infrastructure, just making sure that we're not doing business as usual investments, but really using this moment to shift our investments in the direction that we need them to be from a climate perspective. We are working closely with labor allies. UCS is part of the Blue-Green Alliance, and Kathy sits on their board. And it is a very important part of our engagement to be sure that these are people-centered decisions that don't leave our workers on the sidelines as we make this clean energy transition.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Here's a question that several of you may want to weigh in on. What do you think is needed? What do you think is the needed investment in our institutions, from CDC for information systems to rural hospitals, and again, in the infrastructure that Rachel, you began to talk about to help us deal with these multiple disasters? Gretchen, I see you nodding your head. You want to?
Yeah, I can start.
And then we'll.
Yeah, I could do a whole webinar on this one question. I feel like there's so much that we need to work on, and one thing we're really thinking hard about is how to rebuild science advice and making sure that science is informing all of our decisions. One thing that hasn't made a ton of headlines but is very problematic in my opinion is the number of scientists that have been leaving the government. So leaving places like EPA and CDC, the very agencies that we now really need a lot of smart people there working on these big problems. And many, the remaining federal scientists are disproportionately older and closer to retirement. And so we're looking at a big deficit in knowledge and experience and background that is really going to be needed as all of these issues continue to need a lot of weight and effort put into finding solutions. So one thing that we're thinking about and working on is how do we rebuild that? How do we make it so that good people want to go work in the government and want to be a scientist working for a federal agency? Are there programs? Are there ways we can both recruit more people into government and into these jobs, as well as a greater diversity of people into these jobs? And so we can really get a lot of different perspectives and backgrounds and different people that can help solve these complex problems that we know are going to need a range of expertise. And so I think between that on the internal side, as well as science advice, which is generally comprised of people, academics or other scientists and experts outside of government that volunteer their time and their expertise to inform government decisions on everything from FDA drug approvals to environmental pollution standards to worker safety protections. And so that system has been dismantled to some degree by the Trump administration. And so we'll also need to rebuild that, which, so we're thinking about ways that can happen either through Congress or through agency actions or other external forces.
Thanks, Gretchen. Adrienne or Rachel, would you like to add? Rachel, and then Adrienne.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I think from a climate perspective, one of the things that we've been advocating for a long time is really breaking down silos between agencies, because the way climate change is coming at us affects so many facets of our lives and our economy. It's really important that we have sort of a cross-agency coordination across this complex issue. We also need coordination from the federal to the local, frankly, from the international to the local. And in that sense, it reminds me of the COVID crisis, because you don't solve these big challenges unless you do it in this holistic way by coordinating at all levels. And finally, I think one thing that's been really important for us is recognizing that we've had major blind spots, even in the best of times. We have excluded voices from the conversation. We have not engaged with local stakeholders enough to really understand how our government policies at the federal level and at the state and local level can be informed by what people really need to improve their lives. So we're also advocating in these spaces as we're thinking about institutional change in governance to make sure that, as always, the government is working for the people.
Great. Adrienne, did you want to add?
Actually, both of those answers are great. I was going to say what Rachel said, except I might make a tweak to it. Instead of government working for the people, I would change it to government working with the people, as part of the stakeholder that you described, the bringing everyone to the table. Because communities have a saying: if they're not at the table, they're on the menu. So just making sure that our scientists, which is the information that communities are asking for from scientists, that they are working with communities to answer the questions that communities need answers to, in addition to questions that impact policy.
Thank you. There are many questions here coming up, so let me take one here. So here's a question that, again, we even have a lawyer on our panel here. What will it take to restore environmental regulations that the Trump administration has rescinded? Will it take congressional action? Will it take just executive orders? What will it take? So I imagine we have some information that we can share on that. So Adrienne, Gretchen.
I'll go. My first answer was time. We're not going to be able to do it all in a year or 2 or 3. I don't know. But other than that, it's going to take. It's going to take us. If not speaking flippantly, but honestly, we have to clean house and put people in positions where people that we know care about the public and care about the health of the public. So, you know, those are things that immediately come to my mind, but I know that others have others. Those are just the first 2 I thought of.
Yeah, that's right. I would agree with Adrienne's assessment. We are actually compiling that exact daunting list right now of all the things that need to be undone and how you might do that. So we'll so stay tuned for that. We'll have that ready so that when we get a science-friendly administration, they'll be able to hit the ground running and start working toward addressing many of these challenges. The answer is going to be somewhat varied. I think there's some things that would be you could easily flip with an executive order or an agency directive. There'll be other things that will take many years to redo a rulemaking or even to you know, take back some guidances and things that might have worked their way into the system. I think, unfortunately, a lot of things will take a long time because of the way that it works. So the other option, of course, is in the courts. UCS is also fighting in the courts on some of these rules, and that's another way that we might be able to shortcut killing some of the proposals that are especially harmful. So that's something we're working on as well. And then the other long-term challenge, like I said, is the capacity issue, in that even if, you know, all the rules are all done, it's still going to be a little while before we get our leaders back up to speed in starting to tackle all of the things that they've not been doing these past few years, which is, you know, there's a lot of reporting on the bad things that have happened, but I'm also very concerned with all the things that didn't happen in the last 3 years because of who was in charge and where the priorities were. And so a lot of the environmental justice and equity issues we're discussing on this call, for example, are things that haven't been happening because the EPA Environmental Justice Office, for example, has been gutted by this administration. So a lot of the issues that they would have been working on to start to or continue tackling some of these issues will have not happened. And so we're going to have to play catch up a little and make sure we can rebuild agencies back to the effectiveness they were at before.
Thanks, Gretchen. Rachel, did you want to add?
No, they've covered it really well. And I just maybe briefly, what I would say is, just in case this sounds daunting, we are doing it in partnership with many folks. We're taking leadership on specific aspects of this, and we're working across all avenues: executive orders, administrative strategies, legislation, and really trying to think of all the tools in the toolbox and how to come out of the gate very quickly with a prioritized list, going after the big things first, and making sure that we're being effective.
Great. Well, lucky for us, we have an economist on the panel today as well. So, Rachel, question. The onus is falling on municipalities and counties and nonprofits to take care of COVID and climate issues. And in his own community, the city has run out of money and nonprofits are running out too. So where can the financial support come from to do what we need to do?
This is a profound challenge that's only going to get worse. We're hearing from states and local governments that their budgets are very, very stressed by this economic crisis that's been triggered by COVID. And it is going to start affecting budgets for many, many state and local services, including climate priorities. At this point in time, though, any economist will tell you to come out of a situation like this, we need a huge investment from the federal government. It's a no-brainer. States and cities should not be having to deal with this on their own. And there is a lot of money on the table. Unfortunately, we have fossil fuel companies lining up for bailouts. We have a whole lack of transparency around who's getting money to do what. This is why we've been advocating in Congress for a set of priorities that we know will filter down through the state and local levels, including things like spending on LIHEAP, which is going to help families pay their energy bills, energy efficiency improvements, investments in things like the community development block grant programs that HUD administers and that a lot of states and local governments depend on for many priorities. Transportation funding that can flow to communities. So this is actually a moment when the economic prescription is exactly what state and local governments need, which is huge infusions from the federal government. Our Congress, we're holding their feet to the fire, but you know the reality of the politics in Washington, D.C. There is so much wrong right now. It's not working in the best interest of people. We are absolutely there every day asking for these things to be spent in the right way, and we're doing it in partnership with a lot of folks. So I do have a strong sense that this will be a #1 priority for Congress in the new year.
Thank you, Rachel. There are a number of questions about the upcoming election. And so I wonder if I could ask Gretchen to talk a little bit about some of our electoral work.
Yeah, I think that's probably on many people's mind as well as ours, the upcoming election and what that will mean for a lot of our work. So I can take a minute to share some of the electoral work that we're doing around the election. We have a Science Rising campaign that we work on, and that is very focused on bringing broad coalitions together to encourage participation in voting and activities around and leading up to the election in November. We were motivated to do this because when you look at statistics, many of the people least likely to vote are STEM majors, so students in the sciences, and we wanted to address that and really up that to make sure that those in STEM fields are in fact showing up to the polls and doing their civic duty to vote. And so we have a campaign that works a lot on that issue and thinking about how do we really mobilize the scientific community and science supporters generally to show up, get active, get out the vote, do voting, voter drive campaigns, help to register others to vote. So we have a lot of exciting things happening in that realm. And we're also looking at an intellectual level and more of an analytical side. We have a voting rights fellow with us at the Center for Science and Democracy who looks at the fairness of elections and making sure that people have the right to vote and there aren't interference in those. He's been doing a lot of tracking of some of the state level restrictions that we've seen pop up recently. And he'll also be following a lot of the issues around gerrymandering and how can we make sure we have an evidence-based way of determining districts and representation and making sure that everyone can access the vote. And so we're doing a lot there with, and also in partnership with external organizations that are very exclusively focused on democracy reform and thinking about how to ensure fair and free elections for everyone.
Thank you. So we have a number of questions specifically about climate. One of them is, we're hearing you talk a lot about climate. Can you give us a sense of what some of your policy priorities are on climate? And a related question, given the employment opportunities in renewable energy, how can we see giving marginalized communities the skills and the motivation to move into these opportunity fields? So I'll toss that one first to Rachel.
Sure. In terms of our climate and energy priorities, we are, our top priority right now is to advance support for the renewable energy industry, which, as has been pointed out, is losing jobs right now. And yet we're continuing to see renewable energy outpace coal for 100 days and more now running in terms of beating coal in the market. So here in the US, we have tremendous untapped potential, and we are working to make sure that Congress is supporting renewable energy through tax incentives, and we're advocating for additional policies like a national renewable electricity standard or a clean energy standard that would help advance renewables even more. We're working at the state level on some of these policies too, including state level renewable electricity standards. On the climate side, we as a nation don't have a national climate resilience investment strategy. Instead, we've been doing it piecemeal through agencies like the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and we have been advocating that FEMA spend more of its money in a pre-disaster mode, making sure that communities are more resilient and ahead of time, not just picking up the pieces after. We've been advocating for better data and mapping around risks like flood risks, which are worsening because of climate change, including in coastal areas and inland areas. These are some of our major priorities. We're obviously working on several other ones of them too, but we're also continuing to build out a suite of opportunities where we can have two first, both climate and clean energy resilience, things like microgrids and energy storage that can both advance our renewable energy goals, but also help us become more climate resilient.
Okay, so I want to make sure that we can cover as many as we can. We probably have more questions than we have time to cover, so I'm trying to group them all together here. There's questions about how to fight science denial, and especially how can scientists fight science denial and the science denial that we're seeing among the general public.
I can start. I mean, I think I would just say it seems like it's never been more apparent given COVID, and I actually tweeted. I felt like I underestimated just how far some leaders were willing to take science denial, and it has just blown me away how much we've seen it be so rampant around COVID and the response to it. So I think, you know, we're seeing it continues to be a problem. And so there's two things I'd say about it. I mean, one, I think it's important to remember that, you know, the target isn't necessarily to convince anyone you've ever met that they are wrong about some scientific fact. There is an important role for educating the public and making sure that people have access to the truth. But I think a lot about how we can often be more effective by focusing on decision makers, focusing on people that have influence over what ends up happening, independent of where the public ends up being on science denial. But I share the frustration in that it would be great if everyone accepted the science. And then after that, I'd say, you know, I think the COVID crisis in some ways provides an opportunity in that it is a time when people might be more open to the idea of expertise and understanding the role of scientists and government scientists in keeping them safe and healthy, and we can apply that and help them see that that's no different than climate scientists who are also trying to share public health relevant scientific information with you. And so I've seen a few pieces that discuss some of those issues. So I think we can think about how do we leverage the unfortunate current moment to work against the denial, and I'd welcome others' thoughts here as well.
Okay. Anyone else on the panel want to say anything on that? Rachel?
Well, I just want to emphasize something Gretchen mentioned, which is that we don't waste our energy trying to convince people who are never going to be convinced and have other ulterior motives. Frankly, they start with science denial, but it's pretty clear they have a profit motive. They're in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry, etc. So our job at UCS, which we've always taken very seriously, is to make sure that science is not an ivory tower enterprise, but that it belongs to an informed citizenry, that it belongs to people, and that by translating the science, by making it accessible, by inviting people into obscure processes where their comments and their views definitely count, by broadening the definition of science to include community science, that's where we see our role. I will say, though, that this administration has taken us by just, it's unprecedented because we now at the highest levels of our government have science denial. This is obviously, just unprecedented in many ways. So I understand why it's such cause for deep concern. Again, I think it's not just science, it's facts that are right now under question. Journalists, others are finding this very, very difficult. And someone in the chat has mentioned science education. I think, yes, we have to start at a very young age to have young children in schools and universities and colleges really be thoughtful in the information they consume and ask questions and seek the information from credible sources. And we're happy to play a role in that through the information we share on our website.
Okay, thank you. I know we are rapidly running up against our time, but let me pose this question, a question that says, how can UCS help the mass movement that's now in progress to pressure the government at all levels to address these issues, and especially the issue of racism? Open it up for comments from the panel. Rachel?
I would say that the most important thing is that we get comfortable calling it racism, just being very frank and using the words, talking about the Black lives that are at risk, people who are being killed. One of the challenges that that we have as a nation is that for too long we have obscured facts. We have preferred to think of ourselves as a post-racial society. We have we have denied the reality that is so clearly now laid bare. So I think that's, I mean, for me, the essence of it is that we start with just naming people, naming what's happening. And when it's clear what we've named, the problem has been clearly defined, then only can we devise a kind of solutions that actually address the root cause of the problem, not something superficial, not a detour, not something that's just for today, but something that's really durable.
Any other? Gretchen, would you like to speak?
Yeah, I can just add briefly. I agree with Rachel's point on the importance of that. And another thing I think that is an important role that UCS can play is naming it, as Rachel said, but also getting that and stating that in places and spaces that aren't otherwise hearing that message. Our organization has access to the scientific community and decision makers and other spaces that might not otherwise be hearing about racism, or at least not centering it in other ways. And so I think we have an important role in advancing that, ensuring that the scientific community sees that this is a problem, that it is relevant and necessary for scientists to speak to that. There was a Washington Post article this week that was on this topic specifically, that the scientific community has been speaking out about racism and how that has infiltrated into the scientific community and manifested in various ways. They actually pulled something I had tweeted on it into the article as an opinion from the scientific community. And so I think the more we can lift up those voices and be clear that we intend to join in the fight to be anti-racist. That is a key role that we can play, and then we can be held accountable to that and continue to work toward it as we all work on it as a society.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I know we're at the end of our hour, and I know that there are many questions that we haven't had time to answer. We have them all, so we will be thinking about them. We will be posting, as we said, this webinar on YouTube, and if there are other questions, we will be trying to get back to you with answers. So I guess I want to close by thanking Adrienne and Rachel and Gretchen for engaging in this conversation. And I want to thank all of you for listening and sharing your thoughts and your questions. I think we all acknowledge that this is a really challenging time in many ways, of a scope of things with so many things coming at us that we haven't had to deal with fully before. It's hard. And so it is hard in these times to feel hope. But it's also not the time to give up. So I am feeling hopeful, as some of our panelists said. I believe that each of us individually and collectively, and organizations like UCS and others, can be a force for positive change. We are seeing a lot of energy around this. I really do believe that with steadfastness and determination and compassion, that we can create a society that values Black lives, that values all lives, and that centers our solutions on communities that need them the most. And I know that there have been notable failures, but I do believe that science can be used for the public good. It can be used to create equitable and just outcomes, and we just need to hold ourselves to a very high standard and become even stronger allies for those that are underrepresented, but at the same time bear a disproportionate burden of the impacts that we've talked about today. So I want to thank you all for joining us, for your own work, for your support of what we're doing, and being part of trying to make positive change and being a voice for positive change in this country. So I hope you'll come back next week to this series of calls and webinars that we're having next Thursday, same time. The webinar next week is going to feature some of our UCS experts talking about the intersection of COVID-19 and our food system. So please join us. And again, thank you all. Thank you, our presenters. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.